You ever wonder how much someone would charge you for a pill that costs pennies to make? Not a reasonable markup, not a fair profit, but a price so obscene, so morally bankrupt, that people die because they can't afford medicine that could save them. Because what happened at Valeant Pharmaceuticals wasn't just corporate greed. It was something darker, something that reveals a terrifying truth about what happens when you treat human suffering as a profit opportunity, when you optimize a business model around extracting maximum money from sick people, and when Wall Street rewards you for doing it. And by the end of this story, you're going to understand why the man behind Valeant, Michael Pearson, might represent everything that's wrong with modern capitalism. But here's the thing that's going to shock you. He didn't break any laws at first. He just found every legal loophole, every gray area, every way to maximize profit without technically committing fraud. And Wall Street loved him for it. Investors made billions. Hedge funds celebrated him as a genius, until it all came crashing down and revealed that the entire business model was built on human misery and accounting tricks. So let me take you back to where this nightmare began. Because understanding Valeant means understanding what happens when you let consultants run a pharmaceutical company, like it's a math problem instead of a matter of life and death. Michael Pearson wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't someone who spent his life trying to cure diseases or help people. He was a consultant, a McKinsey guy. He spent years advising companies on how to cut costs and maximize profits, and he got really good at it. Really good at looking at a business and figuring out where the inefficiencies were, where you could squeeze more money out, where you could optimize. And in 2008, when Pearson became CEO of Valeant Pharmaceuticals, he brought that consultant mindset to an industry that maybe shouldn't be run purely for profit. He looked at the pharmaceutical business and saw waste. He saw companies spending billions on research and development, trying to discover new drugs, and most of those drugs never made it to market. Most of that research failed. And Pearson thought, why are we doing this? Why are we spending money on research when we could just buy drugs that already exist and raise the prices? Why invent new medicines when you can acquire old ones and charge whatever you want? And that became Valeant's entire strategy. Don't invest in research. Don't try to cure diseases. Just buy companies that already have drugs, fire most of the employees, cut the research budgets to nothing, and raise prices as high as the market will bear. It was brilliant in its simplicity. It was also morally grotesque. But Wall Street didn't care about morality. Wall Street cared about returns. And Pearson delivered returns like nobody had ever seen. Valeant's stock went from $20 per share in 2008 to $260 per share in 2015. $20 to $260. If you invested $10,000 in Valeant when Pearson took over, you'd have $130,000 7 years later. Investors loved Michael Pearson. Hedge fund managers called him a genius. Business magazines put him on their covers. And he became one of the highest-paid CEOs in America, making tens of millions of dollars a year, because he figured out how to turn human suffering into profit. Here's how the scheme worked. Valeant would identify a pharmaceutical company that owned drugs for serious medical conditions, drugs that people absolutely needed to survive, drugs for heart disease, for organ transplants, for rare conditions where there were no alternatives. And Valeant would buy that company, usually by taking on massive debt. Then they'd immediately fire most of the research staff. They'd shut down the labs. They'd eliminate any projects that weren't already generating revenue. And then they'd raise prices. Not just a little. Not a reasonable increase to cover inflation or development costs. They'd raise prices by 500%. 1,000%. sometimes 2,000%. A drug that cost $100 suddenly cost $2,000. And if you needed that drug to stay alive, you had no choice but to pay it or die. Let me give you a specific example that'll make your blood boil. Valeant bought the rights to two heart drugs called Isuprel and Nitropress. These drugs are used in hospitals for patients in cardiac crisis, life or death situations. And Valeant raised the price of Isuprel by over 700%. Nitropress went up over 300%. Overnight, hospitals that used these drugs to save lives were paying vastly more. And those costs got passed on to patients, to insurance companies, to taxpayers through Medicare and Medicaid. Valeant didn't improve the drugs. They didn't make them more effective or safer. They just raised the price because they could. Because sick people have no negotiating power. Because when your choice is pay or die, you pay. Or consider what they did with dermatology drugs. Valeant acquired several companies that made treatments for skin conditions. Not life-threatening conditions, but conditions that seriously affected people's quality of life. Things like acne medications, treatments for psoriasis, drugs for fungal infections. And they raised prices across the board. A tube of acne cream that cost $80 suddenly cost $800. A treatment for a toenail fungus that cost $500 went to $5,000. And patients were devastated. There are stories of people who couldn't afford their medications anymore, who had to choose between treating their condition and paying rent. People who suffered needlessly because Michael Pearson decided their suffering was worth less than his profits. But here's what made Valeant's strategy even more insidious. They didn't just buy drugs and raise prices. They bought drugs and used captive pharmacies to hide what they were doing. Let me explain how this worked because it's genuinely diabolical. Valeant created a network of specialty pharmacies, including one called Philidor RX services. And these pharmacies existed for one purpose: to make Valeant's drugs seem more accessible than they actually were. Here's the scheme. A patient would get a prescription for a Valeant drug. The doctor would send it to a regular pharmacy, but that pharmacy would see the price, see that insurance probably wouldn't cover it at that price, and they'd tell the patient it's not available or too expensive. So the patient would complain to the doctor, and the doctor would call Valeant's customer service line. And Valeant would say, "No problem, we'll handle it. Send the prescription to our specialty pharmacy, Philidor." And Philidor would fill the prescription. They'd bill the insurance company. And here's the key part. They'd bill the insurance using tactics that were, at best, ethically questionable, and at worst, fraudulent. They'd use different billing codes to make it look like the drug was something else. They'd resubmit rejected claims multiple times, hoping to sneak through. They'd bill under different pharmacy names to avoid detection. And in many cases, insurance companies would pay claims they should have rejected. Claims for drugs at prices that should never have been approved, and Valeant would book that revenue immediately. Even if the insurance company later denied the claim, even if the patient never actually paid. Valeant counted it as revenue the moment Philidor submitted the claim, which meant their reported earnings were inflated, which meant the stock price stayed high, which meant Michael Pearson kept getting richer. Now let me tell you about the man who enabled all of this, Bill Ackman. Bill Ackman ran Pershing Square Capital, one of the biggest and most aggressive hedge funds on Wall Street. And in 2012, Ackman bought a huge stake in Valeant, about 5% of the company, worth billions of dollars. And he didn't just invest. He became Valeant's biggest cheerleader. He went on television and told everyone Valeant was the future of pharmaceuticals. He said Michael Pearson was a genius who had figured out how to run a pharmaceutical company efficiently. He compared Pearson to Warren Buffett, said he was one of the best CEOs in America. And Wall Street listened. When Bill Ackman says a stock is going to the moon, people buy. And Valeant's stock kept climbing, and Ackman kept making money. Billions of dollars. But Ackman wasn't just an investor. He was Valeant's partner in one of the most aggressive and controversial takeover attempts in pharmaceutical history. In 2014, Valeant tried to buy Allergan, the company that makes Botox. Allergan was worth about $50 billion, and Valeant wanted it because Allergan had blockbuster drugs and huge profit margins. But Allergan didn't want to be bought. Their board rejected Valeant's offer. So Valeant and Bill Ackman came up with a plan. Ackman would secretly buy a massive stake in Allergan, nearly 10% of the company. Then Valeant would make a hostile takeover bid. And Ackman, who now owned a huge chunk of Allergan, would pressure the board to accept. It was a coordinated attack, and it was probably illegal. The SEC investigated whether Ackman violated securities laws by buying Allergan shares without proper disclosure. But by the time regulators caught up, Allergan had been saved by another company, Actavis, which bought Allergan in a friendly deal and blocked Valeant's takeover. Ackman made $2 billion on his Allergan investment, $2 billion for a few months of work. And he used that money to buy even more Valeant stock. He believed in Michael Pearson completely. He believed the business model was sustainable. He believed that buying drugs and raising prices was a brilliant strategy that would make everyone rich. And for a while, it looked like he was right. Valeant's market value hit $90 billion in 2015. $90 billion. It was one of the most valuable pharmaceutical companies in the world. And none of that value came from curing diseases or discovering new treatments. It came from buying drugs and charging sick people more money for them. That's it. That's the entire business model. Exploit human suffering for profit. But behind the scenes, cracks were starting to show, because Valeant's strategy had a fundamental problem. To keep growing, they needed to keep buying companies. And to buy companies, they needed to take on more debt. By 2015, Valeant had borrowed over $30 billion. $30 billion in debt on a company that wasn't actually creating value, just extracting it. They were a debt machine wrapped in a pharmaceutical company. And the only way to service that debt was to keep raising prices and keep acquiring more companies to raise prices on. It was a pyramid scheme dressed up in business school jargon. And like all pyramid schemes, it required continuous growth. The moment growth stopped, the moment they couldn't buy another company or raise prices further, the whole thing would collapse. And in 2015, it started to collapse. A short seller named Andrew Left published a report questioning Valeant's relationship with Philidor. He suggested that Valeant was using the specialty pharmacy to inflate revenue, to book sales that weren't real, to hide the fact that patients and insurance companies were rejecting their drugs at the insane prices Valeant was charging. And Left wasn't just some random blogger. He ran Citron Research, and he had a track record of exposing fraudulent companies. When Andrew Left said something was wrong, people paid attention. And when they started looking closely at Valeant's relationship with Philidor, they found something disturbing. Valeant claimed Philidor was an independent pharmacy, just a partner that helped distribute their drugs. But that was a lie. Valeant actually controlled Philidor. They had an option to buy the company. They had access to all its financial data. They were consolidating Philidor's revenue into their own financial statements, which meant Philidor wasn't independent at all. It was essentially a subsidiary that Valeant was using to manipulate revenue. And when this was exposed, investors panicked. The stock started dropping. Not a little correction, a collapse, from $260 per share to under $30 in less than a year. 90% of the company's value evaporated. Bill Ackman's investment, which had been worth $4 billion, was suddenly worth a fraction of that. And he was bleeding money every single day. But Ackman didn't sell. He believed in Michael Pearson. He believed the company was fundamentally sound. He went on television and told investors this was a buying opportunity, that Valeant was oversold, that the market had overreacted. And some people believed him. Some people bought more Valeant stock on Ackman's recommendation. And they lost everything, because Valeant wasn't oversold. It was exposed. The business model that Wall Street had celebrated as genius was revealed as predatory and unsustainable. The accounting that had looked aggressive was revealed as potentially fraudulent. And the CEO that everyone had praised as the next Warren Buffett was revealed as someone who prioritized profits over people, to a degree that was shocking even by pharmaceutical industry standards. In March 2016, Michael Pearson was ousted as CEO. He didn't resign voluntarily. The board forced him out, because the company was in crisis. The debt was crushing them. The stock price was in free fall. Prosecutors were investigating. Congress was holding hearings. And Pearson had become toxic. His reputation went from genius CEO to symbol of everything wrong with American healthcare. But here's what makes this story even more infuriating. Pearson walked away rich. He'd already made hundreds of millions of dollars in salary and stock sales during the boom years. He lost some of it when the stock collapsed, but he was still wealthy beyond imagination. He retired to his mansion and disappeared from public life, while the patients who couldn't afford their medications because of his price, increases continued to suffer. While the investors who trusted him lost their life savings, while employees who believed in the company lost their jobs, Pearson got rich and walked away. Is that justice? Now let me tell you about some of the victims. Because behind every price increase, behind every manipulated billing code, behind every dollar of profit Valeant extracted, there were real people suffering. There was a man named David who needed cupromin, a drug that treats Wilson's disease, a rare genetic disorder that causes copper to build up in your organs and can kill you if untreated. Valeant bought the rights to cupromin and raised the price from $700 per bottle to over $26,000. $26,000 for a drug that costs almost nothing to manufacture. David's insurance company refused to cover it at that price. And David had to choose between going into debt to buy his medication or risking his health. He chose debt. He took out loans, maxed out credit cards, and bought his medication. And he survived. But his financial life was destroyed. All because Michael Pearson decided his profits mattered more than David's health. There was a woman named Susan who suffered from severe psoriasis, a painful skin condition that covered much of her body. She'd been using a foam medication that controlled her symptoms and let her live a normal life. Valeant acquired that drug and raised the price from $2,000 per year to over $20,000. Susan's insurance wouldn't cover it anymore. She tried to get prior authorizations, tried to appeal the denial, spent months fighting with insurance bureaucrats. And while she fought, her condition worsened. The psoriasis spread. The pain intensified. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't work. And eventually, she gave up on the medication because she simply couldn't afford it. She found a less effective alternative that was cheaper. And she lives every day in more pain than she needs to be in because Michael Pearson decided her suffering was less important than his quarterly earnings report. There were parents whose children needed medications for rare conditions, medications that Valeant had acquired and made unaffordable. There were elderly people on fixed incomes who had to choose between their medications and food. There were cancer patients, heart patients, transplant patients, all facing the same impossible choice: pay prices you can't afford, or suffer and maybe die. And Valeant didn't care. Michael Pearson didn't care. The board didn't care. The investors didn't care. Because in their world, in the world of maximizing shareholder value and optimizing profit margins, patients aren't people. They're revenue streams, they're data points, they're acceptable losses in the pursuit of returns. And here's what makes this so much worse than a typical corporate fraud. Most frauds are hidden. The executives know they're breaking the law, and they try to hide it. But Valeant's strategy was out in the open. Michael Pearson talked openly about not investing in research. He proudly explained his acquisition and price increase strategy to investors. He held conference calls where he detailed how much more Valeant was charging for drugs than the previous owners had. And Wall Street applauded. Analysts praised his capital allocation. Investors rewarded the company with a higher and higher stock price. The strategy wasn't secret. It was celebrated, which tells you something terrifying about our healthcare system and our financial system. That you can openly exploit sick people. You can charge them obscene prices for life-saving medication. And as long as you're making money for shareholders, nobody stops you. Nobody even questions it until it goes too far. Now let's talk about what happened when Congress got involved. Because in 2016, Congress held hearings about drug pricing, and Valeant was Exhibit A. Members of Congress from both parties grilled pharmaceutical executives about price increases. They showed charts demonstrating how Valeant had taken drugs and raised prices by absurd multiples. They read testimonials from patients who couldn't afford their medications. They demanded answers, and the answers they got were infuriating. Valeant's executives testified that they set prices based on value to patients, that they used sophisticated economic models to determine what the market would bear, that they offered assistance programs to help patients who couldn't afford their drugs. But it was all nonsense. The value to patients hadn't changed. The drugs weren't better than they were before Valeant bought them. The assistance programs were inadequate and hard to access. The real answer was simpler. Valeant charged as much as they could get away with because there was nothing stopping them. And Congress did nothing. They held hearings. They expressed outrage. They gave speeches about the importance of affordable medication. And then they went back to accepting campaign contributions from pharmaceutical companies and passed no meaningful legislation to control drug prices. Because in America, we treat healthcare as a market, and in markets, prices are determined by supply and demand. And when supply is controlled by monopolies and demand is literally life or death, prices go to whatever maximizes profit. That's not a bug in the system. That's the system working exactly as designed. Valeant just pushed it further than most companies dared to. They said the quiet part loud. They admitted they were maximizing prices on sick people. And for a while, until it collapsed, they were rewarded for it. Let me tell you about the accounting fraud. Because once investigators started digging into Valeant's finances, they found that the problems went way beyond aggressive pricing. The relationship with Philidor wasn't just ethically questionable, it was fraudulent. Valeant had been booking revenue from Philidor that wasn't real. They counted sales before insurance companies approved them. They recorded revenue from prescriptions that were never picked up by patients. They inflated their numbers to meet Wall Street's expectations, to keep the stock price high, to maintain the illusion of growth. And when insurance companies rejected claims, when patients didn't pay, Valeant had to write down that revenue. But they delayed those write-downs. They hid them in footnotes. They spread them across multiple quarters to minimize the impact. It was classic accounting fraud. Recognize revenue too early. Delay recognizing losses. Make the present look better than it is, and hope you can fix it before anyone notices. The SEC investigated. In 2020, they settled with Valeant, which had changed its name to Bausch Health to distance itself from the scandal. The company paid a $45 million fine and admitted to accounting violations. $45 million. That sounds like a lot until you remember that Valeant's executives made hundreds of millions during the fraud, that investors lost tens of billions when the stock collapsed, that patients paid billions in inflated drug prices. $45 million is nothing. It's a rounding error. It's the cost of doing business. And nobody went to jail. Michael Pearson wasn't charged with crimes. The CFO wasn't charged. The executives who built and managed the Philidor relationship weren't charged. They paid a fine and moved on. Is that accountability? Is that justice? Or is that just what happens when you're rich enough and connected enough to buy your way out of consequences? Now let's talk about Bill Ackman's spectacular failure. Because Ackman didn't just invest in Valeant. He bet his reputation on it. He told everyone it was the investment of the decade. He put billions of his hedge fund's money into the stock. And when it collapsed, he lost billions. Not just his money, but his clients' money. Pension funds, endowments, rich individuals who trusted Ackman to manage their wealth. They all lost massive amounts of money on Valeant. And Ackman, who had been celebrated as one of the smartest investors on Wall Street, was suddenly seen as reckless, as someone who got blinded by his own conviction, as someone who fell in love with an investment and couldn't see the obvious problems. But here's the thing. Ackman should have known better. He's not some naive retail investor who got caught up in hype. He's a sophisticated hedge fund manager with teams of analysts and access to company management. He could have asked harder questions. He could have looked more closely at the Philidor relationship. He could have recognized that a business model built on price gouging sick people wasn't sustainable. But he didn't. Because he was making too much money. Because Valeant was the best performing stock in his portfolio. Because admitting there were problems would mean admitting he was wrong. And people like Bill Ackman don't like admitting they're wrong. So he doubled down. He kept buying. He kept promoting the stock. And he kept losing money. Eventually, in 2017, Ackman admitted defeat. He sold all of his Valeant shares at an enormous loss, over $4 billion down to less than $1 billion. He'd lost more than $3 billion of his clients' money on a single investment, and he had to face them and explain how he got it so wrong. How he'd been so convinced Valeant was brilliant when it was actually fraudulent. How he'd trusted Michael Pearson when Pearson was lying to everyone. And you know what Ackman said? He said he'd learned valuable lessons, that he wouldn't make the same mistakes again, that this experience had made him a better investor. But those lessons cost his clients $3 billion. Those lessons came at the expense of pension funds and endowments and charitable foundations that lost money they needed. Was it worth it? Ask Ackman, and he'll say every investment involves risk. Ask his clients, and they might have a different answer. Let me tell you what happened to Valeant after Pearson was forced out. The new management tried to salvage what they could. They changed the company's name to Bausch Health, hoping to escape the Valeant stigma. They sold off assets to pay down the crushing debt. They pledged to be more responsible about pricing. They tried to rebuild trust with patients, doctors, and investors. And to some extent, they've stabilized. The company still exists. It still makes drugs. But it's a shadow of what it was. The stock that traded at $260 now trades around $10. The debt is still enormous. The reputation is permanently damaged. And the business model that Michael Pearson built, the model of acquiring drugs and jacking up prices, that model is dead. Not because it was immoral, though it was, but because it became politically toxic. Because Congress started asking questions. Because prosecutors started investigating. Because even Wall Street realized that you can only push so far before there's a backlash. But here's what should terrify you. Valeant wasn't unique. They were just the most aggressive. Lots of pharmaceutical companies use similar strategies. They buy drugs and raise prices. They use specialty pharmacies and complex billing to maximize revenue. They spend more on marketing and lobbying than on research. They charge Americans vastly more than they charge people in other countries for the same drugs. And they justify it by saying they need high prices to fund research and development. But Valeant proved that was a lie. Because Valeant spent almost nothing on R&D, and they made billions. The high prices aren't about funding research. They're about maximizing profit. And every pharmaceutical company knows it. Valeant just said it out loud. So what's changed since Valeant collapsed? Not much. Drug prices keep rising. Pharmaceutical companies keep buying smaller companies and raising prices. Patients keep choosing between medication and bankruptcy. Congress keeps holding hearings and passing no meaningful reforms. The system that enabled Valeant still exists. The incentives that drove Michael Pearson still exist. The only difference is that companies are more careful now. They're more subtle about price increases. They have better PR strategies. They don't brag about their pricing power on earnings calls. But they're still doing it. They're still extracting maximum profit from sick people. They're just quieter about it. Now let me tell you about something that's going to make you question everything. During the height of Valeant's success, Michael Pearson gave speeches at business schools. He talked to MBA students about his strategy, about how to optimize a pharmaceutical company, about how to create shareholder value. And business school professors praised him. They used Valeant as a case study in successful corporate turnaround. They celebrated his rejection of R&D spending as innovative thinking, and students took notes. They internalized the lesson that maximizing profit is the highest good, that ethical considerations are secondary to returns, that if something is legal and profitable, it's good business. And those students graduated and went to work at pharmaceutical companies and consulting firms and hedge funds. And they brought that mentality with them, the Valeant mentality, the idea that patients are customers to be optimized, not people to be helped. And that mentality is shaping healthcare policy right now. Those former students are CEOs and executives and investors making decisions about drug pricing, about which diseases get research funding, about which patients get access to treatment. And they learned from Michael Pearson that ethics are optional. Think about that. Think about how many people were taught to admire Valeant's strategy. How many young professionals looked at Michael Pearson and thought, I want to be like him. I want to be that successful. I want to create that much shareholder value. They didn't see the patients who couldn't afford their medications. They didn't see the human cost. They just saw the stock chart going up and the billions of dollars in market cap and the praise from Wall Street analysts. And they learned the wrong lessons. They learned that ruthlessness is rewarded, that exploitation is just good business, that maximizing profit justifies any strategy. And now those people are running companies and making decisions that affect millions of lives. That's the real legacy of Valeant. Not just the fraud and the collapsed stock price, but the normalization of predatory pricing strategies throughout the industry. Let me take you inside a specific moment that reveals everything about Michael Pearson's mindset. In 2014, Pearson was at a healthcare conference, and someone asked him about drug pricing, about whether he felt any responsibility to patients who couldn't afford Valeant's medications, and his answer was chilling. He said that Valeant's responsibility was to shareholders, that his job was to maximize returns for the people who invested in the company, that if patients couldn't afford medications, they should talk to their insurance companies or apply for assistance programs. He didn't acknowledge any moral dimension to pricing decisions. He didn't express any sympathy for patients who were suffering because of his price increases. He just talked about shareholder value and capital allocation and return on investment, like he was talking about widgets instead of medicine. Like the people affected by his decisions weren't human beings with families and fears and dreams. They were just numbers in a financial model. And that's what made Pearson so dangerous. Not that he was evil in some obvious mustache-twirling way, but that he was so completely disconnected from the human impact of his decisions. He'd spent his career as a consultant, looking at businesses through spreadsheets, optimizing for efficiency, cutting costs. And when he brought that mindset to pharmaceuticals, he saw sick people as inefficient. Why should we spend billions trying to develop new drugs when we can buy existing drugs and charge more? Why should we price medications affordably when the market will bear higher prices? It was pure optimization, pure rational profit maximization, and it was completely devoid of empathy or ethics or any recognition that healthcare is different from other industries because the product is literally life and death. Now let's talk about what this case reveals about capitalism. Because Valeant is what happens when you take capitalism to its logical extreme in an industry where demand is inelastic. When people need medicine to live, they can't just choose not to buy it if the price is too high. They can't shop around for cheaper alternatives because often there aren't any. They can't negotiate because they have no leverage. So pharmaceutical companies have incredible pricing power. And in a pure capitalist system, companies use that power to maximize profit. That's what they're supposed to do. That's how markets work. But when the market is for life-saving medicine, when the customers are desperate and vulnerable, when the product is the difference between life and death, maybe pure capitalism doesn't work. Maybe we need different rules. Maybe we need to say that some things are too important to be left entirely to market forces. But America hasn't made that choice. We've decided that healthcare is a market, that pharmaceutical companies should be for-profit entities that maximize returns for shareholders. And then we act shocked when those companies prioritize profit over patients, when they charge as much as they can get away with, when they exploit vulnerable people. But that's what we told them to do. We built a system that rewards that behavior. We celebrate CEOs who deliver high returns. We give them massive compensation packages and put them on magazine covers. And then, when someone like Michael Pearson pushes the model too far, when the exploitation becomes too obvious and too extreme, we act surprised. We call it fraud. We hold congressional hearings. But we don't change the underlying system. We don't address the fundamental problem that in American healthcare, profit and patient welfare are often in direct conflict. Let me tell you about one more victim, someone whose story captures the cruelty of Valeant's business model. There was a transplant patient named Emily. She'd received a kidney transplant and needed anti-rejection medication to survive. Without it, Her body would attack the transplanted kidney, and she'd die. The medication she needed was called Chenodal. Valeant bought the rights to it, and they raised the price from $500 per bottle to over $42,000. Emily's insurance initially covered it, but then they changed their formulary and said they'd only cover a cheaper alternative. But the alternative didn't work as well for Emily. Her doctors said she needed to stay on Chenodal. So Emily appealed. She spent months fighting with insurance company bureaucrats, submitting letters from doctors, explaining that she literally needed this drug to stay alive. And the insurance company kept denying her appeals because the price was so high they couldn't justify it. Eventually, Emily's appeal was approved, but it took 6 months. 6 months of uncertainty. 6 months of rationing her medication, taking less than prescribed to make it last, hoping she wouldn't die before the appeal went through. 6 months of stress that damaged her health in other ways. She couldn't sleep. She lost weight. Her blood pressure spiked. And when she finally got approval, when she could finally afford her medication again, she was a different person. The experience had broken something in her. The knowledge that she'd nearly died, not because medicine didn't exist to save her, not because her condition was untreatable, but because a pharmaceutical company had decided her life was worth less than their profits. How do you recover from that? How do you rebuild trust in the healthcare system? Emily is alive, but she's traumatized. And there are thousands of stories like hers. Thousands of patients who survived, but were damaged by Valeant's greed. Patients whose physical health was harmed by the stress of fighting for access to medication. Whose mental health suffered from the knowledge that they were seen as nothing but profit opportunities. Whose trust in medicine and in society was destroyed by companies like Valeant. Here's what I want you to understand about the scale of Valeant's fraud. They didn't just overcharge a few patients. They systematically raised prices on dozens of drugs across multiple therapeutic categories: dermatology, neurology, cardiology, gastroenterology. Any drug they could buy, they raised the price on. And they did it to hundreds of thousands of patients, maybe millions. The total amount of excess cost imposed on the healthcare system by Valeant's price increases runs into the billions of dollars. Billions that came out of insurance premiums, out of patient pockets, out of government healthcare programs. Money that could have been spent on actual healthcare, on research, on prevention, instead went to Valeant's shareholders and executives. It was a massive transfer of wealth from sick people and taxpayers to investors. And most of it was legal. That's what should keep you up at night. Not that Valeant broke laws, though they did eventually, but that most of what they did was allowed. Most of their price increases were completely legal. The fraud came later, when they used Philidor to hide the fact that their model was failing. But the price increases themselves. Legal. Buying drugs and charging whatever you want. Legal. Prioritizing profit over patient access. Legal. That's the system we've built. And Valeant exploited it perfectly. Now let me tell you what happened to the true believers, the Valeant employees who bought into Michael Pearson's vision, who thought they were working for an innovative company that was revolutionizing pharmaceuticals. There were thousands of them. Smart people. Hard-working people. People who believed in the mission and were proud to work at Valeant. And then it collapsed. The fraud was exposed. The stock crashed. The layoffs started. And those employees had to confront the reality that they'd been part of something terrible. That the company they believed in was built on exploitation. That their work had contributed to human suffering. Some of them had invested their retirement savings in Valeant stock because they believed in the company. And they lost everything. Some of them had recruited friends and family to work at Valeant. And now, those people lost their jobs. Some of them had defended Valeant when people questioned the price increases. And now they had to admit they were wrong. The psychological impact on those employees was enormous. There's a former Valeant manager who gave an interview years later. She talked about the guilt she carries, about how she spent years implementing strategies that she now understands were harmful, about how she can't watch certain medical shows on TV because they remind her of patients who probably couldn't afford Valeant drugs, about how she has nightmares where patients are confronting her about price increases. She said that working at Valeant taught her that you can convince yourself anything is justified if your paycheck depends on it, that she rationalized the price increases because that's what everyone around her was doing, that she told herself patients would find a way to afford it, that assistance programs would help, that insurance would cover it. And all of those rationalizations were lies she told herself to avoid confronting the reality that she was participating in something cruel. And here's the thing, she wasn't unique. Thousands of Valeant employees had to go through that same reckoning, had to confront their complicity, had to accept that they'd been part of something that hurt people. And some of them learned from it. They became advocates for healthcare reform. They spoke out about pharmaceutical pricing. They tried to use their experience to prevent future Valeants. But others didn't learn. They moved to other pharmaceutical companies and brought the same strategies with them. They told themselves that Valeant's only mistake was getting caught, that the price increases were fine, the accounting fraud was the problem. And they're still out there, still working in the industry, still making decisions about drug pricing. And that should terrify you. Let me tell you about the congressional testimony that revealed just how broken the system is. In 2016, members of Congress questioned Howard Schiller, Valeant's former CFO, about specific price increases. They showed him a chart of what Valeant had done to a drug called cuprimine. They showed how the price went from $700 to $26,000, and they asked him to justify it, to explain what made the drug worth 37 times more under Valeant's ownership than it had been worth before. And Schiller couldn't answer. He talked about value-based pricing and market dynamics and competitive positioning. He used every piece of business school jargon he could think of, but he couldn't give a real answer because there wasn't one. The drug wasn't better. It wasn't more effective. It wasn't safer. Valeant just decided to charge more because they could, because they had a monopoly on that drug, and patients needed it to live. And you know what's even more infuriating? Schiller walked away from that hearing and faced no consequences. He wasn't charged with crimes. He wasn't fined personally. He lost his job when Valeant collapsed, but he'd already made millions. He was financially set for life from his time at Valeant. So he sat in front of Congress, couldn't justify price increases that harmed thousands of patients, and then went home to his mansion. Is that accountability? Is that what happens when you exploit vulnerable people for profit? You sit through an uncomfortable hearing and then retire wealthy. Because if that's the worst that happens, if that's the price of running a predatory pharmaceutical company, then why wouldn't more executives do exactly what Valeant did? Now let's talk about what Valeant reveals about the healthcare system. Because the company's strategy only worked because of specific features of American healthcare. First, the lack of price controls. In most developed countries, governments negotiate drug prices or set maximum allowable costs. But in America, pharmaceutical companies can charge whatever they want. Second, The complexity of insurance. Valeant exploited the fact that patients often don't know what their drugs really cost, because insurance shields them from the full price. Third, the fragmented market. With hundreds of different insurance companies and pharmacy benefit managers, Valeant could play them against each other, negotiating different prices and using specialty pharmacies to avoid scrutiny. And fourth, the patent system that creates monopolies. When Valeant bought a drug, they often bought the only version of that drug available. Patients couldn't switch to a competitor because there wasn't one. All of these features combine to create an environment where pharmaceutical companies have enormous pricing power. And Valeant pushed that power to its absolute limit. They proved that you can take drugs that people need to survive and charge whatever you want, and there's nothing to stop you except public outrage and potential fraud charges. And even those didn't stop them for years. The price increases started in 2008 when Pearson took over. The company didn't collapse until 2016. That's 8 years of exploitation, 8 years of patient suffering, 8 years of excess profits flowing to shareholders. And most of it was legal. The system allowed it. The system enabled it. And the system still allows it today, because we haven't fixed the underlying problems. Let me tell you about a moment that captures Michael Pearson's complete disconnect from reality. In early 2016, as Valeant was collapsing, as investigations were intensifying, Pearson was called to testify before Congress. And before the hearing, reporters asked him if he regretted the price increases, if he felt bad about patients who couldn't afford their medications. And his answer was stunning. He said he regretted that the price increases had hurt Valeant's reputation. Not that they'd hurt patients, not that people had suffered, but that they'd damaged the company's brand. He was sorry about the public relations problem, not the human cost. And in that moment, he revealed exactly who he was, a man so focused on business outcomes that he couldn't see the human beings affected by his decisions, a man who viewed patient suffering as a PR challenge rather than a moral failure. And Congress destroyed him. They read letters from patients who'd been harmed by Valeant's price increases. They showed pictures of people who'd had to choose between medication and food. They confronted Pearson with the human cost of his strategy. And he had no good answers. He stammered through apologies that sounded hollow. He tried to deflect blame to the healthcare system. He claimed Valeant had assistance programs to help patients. But it was all defensive nonsense. The truth was obvious to everyone watching. Michael Pearson had built a company on exploiting sick people. He'd made hundreds of millions of dollars doing it. And he'd only stopped because he got caught. Not because he developed a conscience. Not because he recognized the harm he was causing. But because the fraud was exposed and the business model collapsed. That hearing should have been the end of Michael Pearson's career. It should have been the moment where he faced real consequences. But it wasn't. He left Valeant with a golden parachute. He walked away with millions in severance and stock that, while diminished, was still worth a fortune. He retired to spend time with his family and manage his wealth. And the patients he'd harmed, they got nothing. No apology, no compensation, no acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong. Just a congressional hearing where representatives expressed outrage for the cameras and then moved on to the next scandal. Now, let's talk about Bill Ackman's role in all of this. Because Ackman wasn't just a passive investor. He was Valeant's biggest cheerleader and enabler. He sat on the board. He helped craft strategy. He defended the price increases publicly. And he made billions before it collapsed. But when the fraud was exposed, Ackman positioned himself as a victim. He said he'd been misled by management, that he hadn't known about the Philidor issues, that he'd trusted Michael Pearson and been betrayed. But that's a lie. Or at least, it's an incomplete truth, because Ackman had access to information that regular investors didn't. He sat on the board. He talked to management regularly. He had teams of analysts studying the company. If anyone should have caught the problems, it was Bill Ackman. But he didn't want to see the problems, because Valeant was making him incredibly wealthy. His investment had gone up several 100%. He was being celebrated as a genius, and admitting there were issues would mean admitting he was wrong, would mean potentially losing money. So he ignored the warning signs. He dismissed the short sellers who questioned Valeant's model. He attacked journalists who wrote critical articles. He did everything he could to maintain the narrative that Valeant was brilliant and the critics were idiots. And in doing so, he helped perpetuate a fraud that harmed thousands of patients. He gave Valeant credibility. His endorsement convinced other investors to buy the stock. His public defenses helped Pearson deflect criticism. Bill Ackman was complicit, not criminally maybe, but morally. He helped build and defend a company whose business model was predatory, and he profited enormously from it before it collapsed. And you know what Ackman said after he finally sold his Valeant shares at a massive loss? He said it was a learning experience, that he'd made mistakes and would do better next time, that every investor has losses, and this was just an expensive lesson. But this wasn't just a bad investment. This was active participation in a company that harmed people. And Ackman has never acknowledged that. He's never apologized to the patients who were affected. He's never taken responsibility for his role in enabling Valeant's predatory practices. He just wrote it off as a bad investment and moved on. And that tells you everything you need to know about how Wall Street views healthcare. Patients aren't people. They're just variables in an investment thesis. And when the investment goes bad, you don't think about the human cost. You just take your loss and find the next opportunity. Let me tell you about what happened to the specialty pharmacy, Philidor. Because when Valeant's relationship with Philidor was exposed, when investigators started looking closely, they found something even more disturbing than inflated revenue. They found that Philidor had been operating illegally in several states. They didn't have proper pharmacy licenses. They were billing under the names of other pharmacies without authorization. They were using fake identities to resubmit rejected insurance claims. It was fraud. Obvious, blatant fraud. And Valeant knew about it. Or at least, they should have known. Because Valeant had access to Philidor's operations, they were receiving data about prescriptions and billing. They were coordinating on strategy. So either Valeant knew Philidor was committing fraud and ignored it because it was profitable, or they deliberately didn't ask questions because they didn't want to know the answers. Either way, it's inexcusable. Philidor shut down in 2015 when the scandal broke. The owners disappeared from public view, and Valeant tried to distance itself, claiming they'd been deceived by Philidor's management. But investigators found emails showing Valeant executives discussing Philidor's aggressive billing practices. They found evidence that Valeant had encouraged Philidor to maximize reimbursement even when insurance companies were rejecting claims. They found a paper trail showing that Valeant and Philidor were working together to inflate revenue. And yet, nobody went to jail. Philidor shut down. Valeant paid a fine. The executives involved moved on to other jobs, and the fraud was just another line item in the settlement agreement. No criminal charges, no personal accountability, just a corporate fine that represented a tiny fraction of the money that had been stolen. Think about what that means. Philidor committed fraud. Blatant, obvious fraud. Billing under fake names, operating without proper licenses, deceiving insurance companies, and nobody faced criminal prosecution. Compare that to someone who commits welfare fraud for a few $1,000s and goes to prison. Compare it to someone who steals a car and gets years behind bars. The people running Philidor stole millions through fraudulent billing schemes, and they faced no criminal consequences. Is that a justice system? Is that equality under the law? Or is that just what happens when you're wealthy enough and connected enough to commit fraud through corporate structures instead of street crime? Now let me tell you about the investors who lost everything. Because when Valeant collapsed, it wasn't just Bill Ackman and other hedge funds that lost money. It was pension funds, teacher retirement systems, municipal employee pensions. These funds had invested in Valeant because it looked like a successful, growing pharmaceutical company. Because major investors like Bill Ackman endorsed it. Because Wall Street analysts gave it high ratings. And they lost billions. Billions of dollars that were supposed to fund retirements for teachers and firefighters and police officers and government workers. People who spent their careers in public service, who saved diligently, who trusted that their pension funds were being managed responsibly. And those pension funds invested in Valeant and lost enormous amounts of money. There's a teacher in California named Margaret. She worked for 35 years in public schools. She retired in 2014, expecting a comfortable pension. And then, Valeant collapsed. Her pension fund had invested heavily in Valeant stock. And when the stock crashed, the fund's value dropped significantly. Margaret's monthly pension check was cut by 15%. 15% of her retirement income, gone, because pension fund managers invested in a pharmaceutical company that was committing fraud. And Margaret can't get that money back. She can't work another 35 years to make up the loss. She's 70 years old. She has to live on less than she expected. She has to make hard choices about healthcare and housing, and whether she can help her grandchildren with college. And it's not her fault. She didn't invest in Valeant. She didn't even know her pension fund owned Valeant stock. But she's paying the price. And there are thousands of stories like Margaret's. Thousands of retirees whose pensions were reduced because their funds lost money on Valeant. Thousands of workers whose retirement security was damaged by a pharmaceutical company's fraud. And those victims, unlike the shareholders who can sue and sometimes recover losses, they have no recourse. Pension funds don't make beneficiaries whole when investments go bad. They just reduce benefits. And retirees have to live with less. So Valeant's fraud didn't just hurt patients who couldn't afford medications. It hurt retirees who lost pension income. It hurt employees who lost their jobs. It hurt communities that relied on tax revenue from a company that collapsed. The damage was enormous and widespread. And the people responsible faced minimal consequences. Let's talk about what's happened since Valeant collapsed. What lessons have been learned? What reforms have been implemented? And the answer is going to make you angry. Almost nothing has changed. Drug prices continue to rise. Pharmaceutical companies continue to buy smaller companies and raise prices. The industry continues to prioritize profit over patient access. Congress holds occasional hearings and expresses outrage, but passes no meaningful price control legislation. The FDA continues to approve drugs without considering affordability. Insurance companies continue to deny coverage for expensive medications and force patients into complex appeals processes. The specialty pharmacy model that Valeant exploited still exists and is still being used to maximize revenue. The only real change is that companies are more careful. They raise prices more gradually. They have better explanations prepared. They don't brag about their pricing power on earnings calls. But they're still doing it. And new Valeants are emerging. Companies that buy old drugs and raise prices. Companies that use complex billing schemes to maximize reimbursement. Companies that prioritize financial engineering over research and development. They've learned from Valeant's mistakes. They know not to push too far too fast. They know to maintain better relationships with regulators and politicians. They know to be more subtle about their exploitation. But they're still exploiting patients. They're still prioritizing profit over access. They're still treating healthcare as a market where the goal is to extract maximum revenue from vulnerable people. And they're getting away with it because the underlying system hasn't changed. The incentives that created Valeant still exist. The regulatory failures that allowed Valeant to thrive still exist. We've learned nothing. Now let me tell you about something that should make you question everything about pharmaceutical innovation. Valeant's model was explicitly anti-research. Michael Pearson said openly that R&D spending was wasteful, that most research fails, that it's more efficient to buy drugs that already exist than to try to discover new ones. And Wall Street agreed. Investors rewarded Valeant for cutting R&D. The stock price went up every time Pearson explained how little Valeant spent on research. Because research is expensive and risky and takes years to pay off, buying existing drugs and raising prices generates immediate profits. From a pure financial perspective, Pearson was right. Valeant's strategy was more profitable than traditional pharmaceutical R&D, which tells you something terrifying about how we fund medical innovation. We rely on for-profit companies to develop new drugs. We rely on the market to allocate resources to research. But the market doesn't care about curing diseases. The market cares about returns. And if buying old drugs and raising prices generates better returns than discovering new drugs, then rational profit-maximizing companies will do exactly what Valeant did. They'll cut research. They'll acquire existing products. They'll focus on financial engineering instead of medical innovation. And over time, that means less new drug development, fewer cures discovered, more diseases that remain untreatable because there's no profit in finding treatments. Valeant proved that you can make more money exploiting existing drugs than creating new ones. And that's a devastating indictment of how we structure pharmaceutical innovation. Think about what would happen if Valeant's model became the industry standard. If every pharmaceutical company decided to stop investing in R&D and just buy existing drugs and raise prices, we'd have no new antibiotics, even though antibiotic resistance is becoming a crisis. We'd have no new treatments for rare diseases because there's no existing drugs to buy. We'd have no innovation in areas like Alzheimer's or ALS or other conditions that desperately need new therapies. Medical progress would stop, and people would die from diseases that could have been cured if we'd invested in research instead of financial engineering. That's the logical endpoint of Valeant's philosophy. That's what happens when you let pure profit maximization drive healthcare. And we came dangerously close to that becoming normal. Valeant was celebrated for years. If they hadn't been exposed for fraud, if the Philidor relationship hadn't collapsed the company, Valeant's model might have become the template for the entire industry. Let me tell you about one final victim, someone whose story should haunt everyone involved in Valeant. There was a man named Thomas who needed a drug called Cyprine to treat Wilson's disease. Valeant bought the rights to Cyprine and raised the price from around $900 per bottle to over $21,000. Thomas's insurance company denied coverage at that price. Thomas appealed and was denied again. He tried to get assistance from Valeant's patient support program, but was told he made too much money to qualify. So Thomas was faced with an impossible choice. He could spend over $200,000 a year on his medication, which would bankrupt him. Or he could go without it and risk his health. Thomas tried rationing his medication, taking less than prescribed, hoping it would be enough to keep him alive while he figured out what to do. But Wilson's disease doesn't negotiate. The copper built up in his liver. His health deteriorated. He ended up in the hospital with liver failure, and he died waiting for a transplant. Thomas was 43 years old. He had a wife and 2 children. He had a good job and health insurance and was doing everything right. And he died because Valeant decided his life was worth less than their profits. His death could have been prevented. The medication exists. It's not expensive to manufacture. But Valeant had a monopoly on it and charged a price that made it inaccessible. And Thomas died. And Michael Pearson never knew his name, never thought about him, never lost a moment of sleep over the fact that his pricing strategy killed people. Because in Pearson's world, Thomas wasn't a person. He was a data point, an edge case, an acceptable loss in the pursuit of maximizing shareholder value. And that's what makes this story so much more than a typical corporate fraud. People died. Not figuratively. Actually died. Because a pharmaceutical company decided profit was more important than life. So here we are, at the end of this story. And I want you to sit with something uncomfortable. Everything I've told you about Valeant, all the price increases, and the exploitation and the fraud, most of it was legal when it was happening. The Philidor relationship was fraudulent, yes. The accounting was manipulated, yes. But the core business model, buying drugs and raising prices on sick people, that was legal. That was allowed. That was celebrated by Wall Street. Michael Pearson didn't break any laws by raising the price of cupramine from $700 to $26,000. He didn't break any laws by cutting R&D spending. He didn't break any laws by prioritizing shareholder returns over patient access. He just did what the system incentivizes pharmaceutical companies to do. He just did it more aggressively and more openly than most. And that should terrify you, because it means the system itself is broken. It means that the rules we've created for healthcare allow companies to exploit vulnerable people for profit. It means that you can legally charge whatever you want for life-saving medicine, and there's nothing to stop you except public outrage. And public outrage is fleeting. We were outraged about Valeant for a while. There were hearings and investigations and media coverage. And then we moved on to the next scandal. And drug prices kept rising. And pharmaceutical companies kept maximizing profit. And patients kept suffering. Because outrage without action is meaningless. And we haven't taken action. We haven't reformed the system. We haven't fixed the incentives. We haven't created rules that actually protect patients instead of profits. So what do you do with this information? What do you do with the knowledge that companies like Valeant can legally exploit you? That the medicine you might need to save your life could be priced so high you can't afford it. That your pension fund might lose money because it invested in pharmaceutical fraud. That the system is rigged against patients and in favor of shareholders. You can be angry. You should be angry. But anger alone doesn't change anything. You need to demand reform. You need to vote for politicians who will actually regulate drug prices, who will strengthen the FDA's power to consider affordability, who will create real penalties for exploitation. You need to support organizations working to reform healthcare. You need to share stories like Thomas's, like Susan's, like David's, like all the victims of Valeant's greed. Because as long as those stories stay hidden, as long as pharmaceutical exploitation happens in the shadows, nothing will change. And you need to remember that this isn't over. Valeant collapsed. Michael Pearson is gone. But the system that created Valeant still exists. The incentives that drove Pearson's strategy still exist. And right now, somewhere, there's another CEO looking at pharmaceutical pricing and thinking, I can do what Valeant did. I just need to be smarter about it. There's another hedge fund manager investing in a pharmaceutical company with aggressive pricing strategies. There's another patient receiving a prescription and finding out their medication now costs thousands of dollars more than it did last month. The pattern continues. The exploitation continues. And it will keep continuing until we collectively decide that healthcare is different. That medicine isn't just another market commodity. That profit maximization can't be the only goal when the product is human life. Michael Pearson probably sleeps fine at night. He's wealthy. He's comfortable. He's insulated from the consequences of his decisions. The patients whose lives he destroyed, they're not his problem anymore. The investors who lost money, that's just capitalism. The employees who lost jobs, that's just business. He can tell himself he followed the rules, maximized shareholder value, did what he was supposed to do as a CEO. And technically, for most of his tenure, he did. He operated within the legal system we've created. He just pushed it to an extreme that exposed how broken that system is. And that's the final, most disturbing lesson of Valeant. The problem isn't one bad CEO. The problem is a system that allows and even rewards that kind of CEO, that celebrates exploitation as innovation, that prioritizes financial returns over human welfare, that treats healthcare as just another industry where the goal is to extract maximum profit. Until we fix that system, until we decide that patient welfare matters more than shareholder returns, until we create rules that actually prevent exploitation instead of just punishing the most egregious cases after the damage is done, there will be more Valeants. More companies treating sick people as profit opportunities. More patients choosing between medication and bankruptcy. More deaths that could have been prevented if medicine was priced affordably. And more CEOs walking away wealthy after building empires on human suffering. That's the world we live in. That's the choice we've made. And until we make a different choice, until we demand a system that actually protects vulnerable people instead of exploiting them, the pattern will continue. The suffering will continue. And stories like Valeant's, stories of predatory pricing and fraudulent accounting and human cost measured in billions of dollars and thousands of ruined lives, those stories will keep happening, again and again and again, because we've built a system that guarantees it, and changing that system requires more than outrage. It requires action. It requires political will. It requires all of us deciding that enough is enough, that healthcare is a right, not a market opportunity, that profit can't be the only consideration when lives are at stake. Are we ready to make that decision? Are we ready to demand that change? Or are we going to keep accepting that this is just how things are, just how business works, just the price of capitalism? Because if we choose acceptance, if we choose to do nothing, then we're complicit in the next Valeant. We're complicit in the next price increase that kills someone. We're complicit in a system that values money more than human life. And we'll have nobody to blame but ourselves. Did you like the story? And from where are you listening? Tell us in the comments. And if you liked the story, please help us by liking and subscribing too. Keep our work going in unfolding the biggest financial crimes in human history. You are what makes our work count.